The first time I met her, I didn't think much of it. She was my elder brother's wife, graceful, polite, and always carrying herself with dignity. At family gatherings, she moved with an effortless charm, taking care of everyone, smiling when needed, and speaking only when necessary. I had no reason to see her as anything more than my Bobby. But something changed. It started with small things. A glance held a little longer than necessary. A fleeting smile that seemed meant only for me. I ignored it at first, dismissing it as my imagination. But the more I noticed, the more I realized it wasn't just in my head. One evening, we were sitting in the living room with the family, watching television. My brother had dozed off, and the conversation was light. I made a casual joke and she laughed, really laughed. It wasn't the polite, reserved chuckle she gave to everyone. It was real, spontaneous. And as her eyes met mine, I felt something shift. From that day, things were different. There were stolen glances across the room, moments when our hands brushed against each other accidentally, yet neither of us pulled away immediately. It was subtle, unspoken, but unmistakable. The first time we were alone was unplanned. My brother had left for work early, and I had stayed the night at their house after a late family gathering. I woke up to the sound of her humming softly in the kitchen. Still half asleep, I walked in to get a glass of water. She turned to me, surprised, but didn't step back when I reached for the glass near her hand. Our fingers touched, and for the briefest second, neither of us moved. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes, a hesitation, a silent question. I knew I should look away, step back, but I didn't. Neither did she. That moment lingered in my mind all day. I kept thinking about the way she looked at me, the warmth of her touch. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was overthinking. But the next time we were in the same room, I caught her staring at me before quickly looking away. Then came the late-night messages, innocent at first. A simple, "Did you reach home safely?" or "You left your book here?" But soon, the messages got longer. Conversations stretched into the night. We talked about everything, life, dreams, regrets. She told me things she had never told anyone. One evening, while the family was gathered outside, she sat next to me on the couch, close enough that our arms touched. My heartbeat quickened, but I said nothing. Then, in a low voice, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you're living a life that doesn't belong to you?" I looked at her, seeing past the perfect wife, the ideal daughter-in-law. I saw the loneliness in her eyes, the longing for something more. I knew what she meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her words, about the way she looked at me, about how much I wanted to see her smile again. A few days later, she called me into the kitchen while everyone was outside. She handed me a cup of tea, her fingers brushing against mine for just a second too long. This time, she didn't pull away immediately. She looked up at me, searching for something in my face, and then, almost in a whisper, she said, "You notice things about me that no one else does." There was a pause, a silent acknowledgement of something we both felt but hadn't spoken about. My mind screamed at me to walk away, but my heart told me to stay. That was the moment I knew. This was no longer just a fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, something dangerous. And neither of us had the strength to stop it. The first time we crossed the line, it wasn't planned. It wasn't something we had spoken about or even acknowledged in words. It just happened. She was standing close, too close, and neither of us moved away. There was a pause, a moment stretched thin between us, and then she looked up at me with something unspoken in her eyes. My heart pounded, my breath caught, and before I could think, my hand brushed against hers. This time, she didn't pull away. That touch changed everything. After that night, there was no going back. The messages became more frequent, the conversations more intimate. What started as harmless texts turned into long, late-night confessions. She told me things she had never told anyone, how she felt unseen, how her marriage had become routine, how she had stopped feeling like herself. I listened, not just because I wanted to, but because I understood. We found excuses to be alone. A few minutes in the kitchen while the family was distracted. A brief moment in the hallway where our hands brushed and stayed. The tension between us grew, the pull becoming stronger with every passing day. The first real moment of weakness came when we were alone at home. He had gone out for work, and the house was quiet. I should have left, but I didn't. She should have walked away, but she stayed. The silence between us was heavy, charged with everything we had been holding back. She looked at me, her breathing unsteady. "This is wrong," she whispered, but she didn't move. I stepped closer, searching her face for hesitation. There was none. Only longing. Only the same need I felt burning inside me. I shouldn't have touched her. I knew that. But the moment my hand rested on hers, the last of her resistance crumbled. The world outside ceased to exist. Nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the risks. Just us. Just this. But even in the height of passion, there was fear. The fear of being caught, of losing everything. She tensed at the sound of a passing car, her breath hitching in panic. "We have to be careful," she murmured against my skin. I nodded, but deep down, I knew something had changed. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. This was the beginning of something unstoppable. We promised to be careful, to keep our distance in public, to act as if nothing had happened. But desire doesn't follow rules. It doesn't care about consequences. It only grows stronger, more reckless. Every stolen moment after that was electric. A brush of fingers when no one was looking. A hurried touch in the shadows. A whispered conversation filled with unspoken need. And yet, beneath the thrill, there was always the looming shadow of what we had done. What we were still doing. Neither of us wanted to stop. But deep down we both knew this wasn't a story that could have a happy ending. She had become an addiction. Every stolen glance, every whispered conversation, every touch that lingered longer than necessary, it all pulled me deeper. But with every moment of passion, there was an undercurrent of fear. Fear of being caught. Fear of what would happen if anyone found out. At first, we were careful. Every meeting was calculated, every conversation coded. But emotions are reckless. The more we tried to keep it hidden, the harder it became to resist. I wanted more. More time. More moments. More of her. But she was growing restless. She became distant, more cautious than before. Messages were left unanswered for hours. She no longer smiled as freely when others were around. When I questioned her, she sighed. "This is dangerous. We can't keep doing this." I knew she was right, but I couldn't accept it. I started noticing the way she pulled away when my brother was around, how she avoided being alone with me. It was subtle, but I felt it. And then came the worst part, paranoia. Her husband began noticing the smallest things. How she was on her phone more often. How she seemed lost in thought. One evening, as I sat across from him at dinner, he casually mentioned, "She's been acting strange lately. Quiet. Distant. You think something's wrong." My hands tensed around my glass. I forced a casual laugh and shrugged. Maybe she's just tired. But I knew the truth. She was slipping away from me, and I was losing control. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone again, but this time, she was different. There was no excitement in her eyes, only fear. "We have to stop this before it's too late," she said, voice barely above a whisper. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "We won't get away with this forever." The thought of losing her made me reckless. I stopped caring about being careful. I started taking risks, sending messages even when I knew she was with him, calling when I shouldn't. I needed her to know I wasn't ready to let go. Then came the close call, a message I sent late at night, one she forgot to delete. I didn't know it had happened until the next morning when I received a single message from her. "We need to talk. Now." My heart pounded as I rushed to meet her. She was pale, shaken. "He saw your message," she said, voice trembling. Panic set in. "What did he say?" "Nothing." He looked at me and walked away. That was worse than yelling. Worse than anger. He knew. Or, at least, he suspected. And suspicion was all it took. From that moment, everything changed. Every time I saw him, I expected confrontation. Every time she spoke to me, it was laced with tension. The world around us was closing in. And yet, I still wasn't ready to let her go. The weight of what we had done was crushing her. She had always been the careful one, the one who worried about consequences. But now, she was drowning in them. The guilt, the fear, it was tearing her apart. She had started avoiding me. No more late-night messages. No more stolen moments. When we were in the same room, she barely looked at me. And when she did, her eyes held something I hadn't seen before: regret. I refused to accept it. I told myself she was just being cautious, that she still wanted me the same way I wanted her. But deep down, I knew the truth. She was trying to let go. I confronted her one evening when we finally found ourselves alone. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice low, desperate. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned away, gripping the edge of the table as if trying to steady herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because this can't go on. We both know that." I shook my head, refusing to accept it. "We can make this work. We just have to be careful." She let out a bitter laugh, turning to face me. "Careful? Do you think this is just about not getting caught? It's more than that. It's what we've become. What this is turning us into." I stepped closer, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "I love you," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. Her eyes filled with tears. "Don't say that." "But it's the truth." She exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for a moment as if trying to gather herself. When she opened them again, I saw her decision was already made. "I love you too," she admitted. "But love isn't always enough." I felt my chest tighten. "So that's it? After everything?" She looked at me with an ache I couldn't describe. "I have a life, a family, and no matter how much I want you, I can't destroy everything for this." Her words cut deeper than I expected. I wanted to fight, to convince her that we could find a way. But I saw it in her eyes. She had already chosen. For the first time, I realized how this would end. Not in some dramatic revelation. Not with anger or betrayal. Just with quiet heartbreak. She stepped back, wiping her tears quickly before turning toward the door. "This has to be the last time," she said, barely above a whisper. I watched her leave, knowing she wouldn't turn back. The next day, she was different. Distant. Colder. She smiled at everyone like nothing had happened. She laughed at my brother's jokes, played the role of the perfect wife. And just like that, we became strangers again. But I knew. She knew. Some loves are never meant to last.